Have you ever just, held a copy of the Qur'an and thought beyond the words themselves? Like, how did it actually get put together this way?
Yeah, the physical arrangement.
Hmm.
Who decided which chapter goes where? Why this verse here and not somewhere else?
Exactly. There's such a fundamental question, but maybe one we don't always stop to ask. How did the Qur'an get its current structure?
It's a huge question, really, tied into the history of the text, its preservation, everything.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're exploring this whole issue of the sequence, the tartib, as it's called, of the Qur'an's chapters, the surahs, and its verses, the ayats.
Right. And we're drawing on a source that really digs into the scholarly debate around this, laying out different views and the evidence behind them.
So our mission here is to unpack this source together. We want to understand the different perspectives, look at the arguments, the evidence they cite, and just see what kind of fascinating insights pop up about how the Qur'an was compiled and, passed down to us. Okay, let's get into it.
Okay. So the core question, the central debate that our source lays out is essentially this. Was the sequence of the Quran chapters and verses finalized by Prophet Muhammad himself during his lifetime based on divine instructions?
Okay, so option one, divinely directed by the prophet.
Or was it arranged after his passing by his companions using their own collective reasoning, their ijtihad?
Right. So human arrangement after the fact. Those are the two main camps the source identifies.
Pretty much. There's one view, which the source identifies as being held by a minority, including some Sunni scholars, that suggests, well, that the prophet left the Quranic revelations somewhat scattered, maybe on pieces of leather, bone, leaves, whatever was available.
And in that scenario, the companions later gathered all these scattered bits and pieces and basically figured out the order themselves.
That's the idea in that view. They compiled it and arranged the chapters and verses into the sequence we have today.
Okay, that's one perspective. What's the other main one?
The other position, which the source describes as the majority view held by most Shia scholars and also many, many Sunni scholars, is quite different. It holds that the sequence we have now is precisely the sequence the prophet established before he passed away.
So not left scattered, but intentionally ordered.
Exactly. Ordered according to divine guidance received via the angel Jibreel or Gabriel.
Okay, so the source leans towards explaining the evidence for this majority view, the idea that it was settled during the prophet's time.
Yes, it presents several lines of argument supporting that, and they really make you pause and think about the whole process.
Where does it start? What's the first piece of evidence?
Well, one key area is the hadith literature, the recorded sayings and actions of the prophet. The source points to specific narrations, even ones found in widely accepted Sunni collections, that seem to give clues.
Like what kind of clues?
There's a well-known hadith from Ibn Abbas. It talks about a specific verse, verse 281 in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter, the one about fearing the day of judgment. According to this narration, when that verse was revealed, Jibreel explicitly told the prophet, "O Muhammad, put this verse at the end of verse 280 of Surah Al-Baqarah."
Wow, that's very specific. Not just here's a verse for Surah Baqarah, but exactly where to slot it in.
Precisely. Right down to the preceding verse. The level of detail is quite striking, isn't it?
It really is. So what's the implication the source draws from that?
Well, two main things. First, it suggests the revelation process was likely nearing its end if specific placements were being finalized. But maybe more crucially, it implies there must have already been some kind of compiled structure or text in existence.
Ah, because how else could Jibreel say, put it here after that?
Exactly. The source kind of poses the question, if the Quran was just a pile of loose scattered notes, where is here? Where is after verse 280? It suggests a physical collection, a scroll or codex or something, was being actively maintained and updated under the prophet's supervision.
That makes sense. Does the source mention other examples like this?
It does. It mentions another hadith, this one narrated by Ahmad ibn Hanbal from Usman ibn Abi al-As. Similar story. Jibreel comes and instructs the prophet to place a specific verse, in this case, verse 90 of Surah Al-Nahl, into that particular surah.
Okay.
And the key point is that the prophet would then communicate these placements to his companions, the scribes. So these narrations really challenge the idea of the Qur'an being left completely disorganized. They point towards an ongoing process of compilation and sequencing guided by revelation.
So the companions were writing things down, yes, but the source argues the prophet was the one directing where everything went.
That's the picture it paints. They'd bring the written pieces to him, and he, guided by revelation, would say, put this here, put that there, establishing the final sequence.
The source also brings up a sort of logical argument too, right?
Mm-hmm.
About the prophet's mission.
Yes, it makes the point that the Qur'an was, the absolute cornerstone of the prophet's entire life work, his greatest project. It seems, well, almost unthinkable, or as the source puts it, maybe even irresponsible, for him to leave this foundational text completely uncompiled and scattered at the end of his life.
Leaving its final form up to chance or interpretation later.
Right. The argument is that ensuring its proper compilation and sequence would have been a critical part of completing his mission, so his active involvement seems logically necessary.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the argument based on the current order of the Quran? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It really does. The source asks, okay, let's imagine the companions did arrange it after the prophet passed. They'd use their best judgment, their ijtihad. What system, what methodology would a committee likely use for such a sacred and monumental task?
You'd expect.
Yeah.
Something logical, right? Some kind of clear organizing principle.
Exactly. Maybe chronology. Put the chapters revealed in Mecca first, then the ones from Medina, or group them by period.
But the Quran we have isn't like that, is it?
Not at all. It famously starts with Surah Al-Hamd, or Al-Fatiha, which is Meccan, very early, but then immediately jumps to Surah Al-Baqarah, the longest chapter, which is largely Medinan, revealed much later, and then it continues to mix Meccan and Medinan chapters throughout. Chronology is clearly not the system.
Okay, so scratch chronology. What about size?
Yeah.
That seems like a possible human method. Arrange them from longest chapter to shortest.
People often think that might be the case, especially since Al-Baqarah, the longest, comes second. But it doesn't hold up consistently either. You start short, Al-Ham, then go to the longest, Al-Baqarah, but after that, it's all over the place. You get long chapters followed by shorter ones, then longer ones again. There's no clear descending or ascending order by length.
Okay, not size. Maybe. The number of verses in each chapter.
The source looks at that too. Again, no consistent pattern emerges. Al-Baqarah has the most verses, 286. But the chapters listed right after it in the traditional order, like Ash-Shu'ara, 227 verses, Al-Araf, 206 verses, Al-An'am, 165 verses, they don't follow a clear numerical sequence relative to each other or to what comes next.
So no obvious human system seems to fit the final product.
That's the point the source makes. If it wasn't chronology, wasn't size, wasn't verse count, what was the methodology? It's hard to imagine a committee arranging something so vital using, well, what looks like randomness from a human perspective. This lack of a discernible human pattern is presented as strong evidence against a purely human arrangement. It points towards a different kind of order.
A divinely intended one, presumably.
That's the inference. And there's one more historical point the source adds here.
Which is?
The almost complete lack of historical documentation about the companions actually debating the sequence of the surahs. If they undertook this massive, potentially contentious task of ordering the entire Qur'an after the prophet's death, you'd expect records, discussions, disagreements. It would have been a huge deal.
Yeah, you'd think there'd be accounts of meetings, arguments about which chapter should go where.
Exactly. But the historical record is surprisingly silent on such a large-scale arrangement process for the sequence of chapters. This silence, the source suggests, further supports the idea that the sequence was already established and known, settled by the prophet himself.
Okay, so that builds a pretty strong case for the mainstream view. The sequence is divine, fixed by the prophet. But then the source introduces a twist, right? A kind of nuance, specifically about the placement of certain verses within chapters.
Yes, exactly. It brings up a very specific, and it stresses, a minority viewpoint that exists within Shia scholarship.
Okay, what's this minority view?
This view suggests that while the overall order of the chapters might be as the prophet left it, it's possible that the placement of a few specific individual verses within certain chapters might have been, well, altered by some companions later on.
Altered? Why?
The hypothesis usually involves political motives. That certain verses with sensitive political or theological implications might have been moved from their original context to perhaps obscure their meaning or significance.
Interesting. Does the source give examples of verses where this is hypothesized?
It discusses two main examples often brought up by proponents of this minority view. The first is a famous verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 3. It contains the line, This day have I perfected for you your religion and completed my favor upon you and chosen for you Islam as a religion.
A hugely significant statement, completion of the religion.
Absolutely. Now, the thing that raises questions for this minority view is the context. This profound declaration appears smack in the middle of verses detailing forbidden foods, haram meats, rules about animals, dietary laws.
Oh, right. That does seem like an odd pairing. Dietary rules, then bam, religion perfected, then back to food.
It feels abrupt to some. So the hypothesis of this minority view is this. They interpret this verse as referring to the event of Ghadir Khumm, related to the leadership of Imam Ali. They suggest that perhaps companions, wanting to downplay this significance, moved the verse from a more prominent or thematically relevant spot and tucked it away here, within the less controversial topic of food laws.
Kind of like hiding it in plain sight, to make it less obvious or easier to overlook its alleged original meaning.
That's the essence of the hypothesis, obscuring its political weight by placing it in an unexpected, seemingly mundane context.
Okay, that's one example. What's the other one mentioned?
The other is Ayah-e-Tathir, the verse of purification found in Surah Al-Azab, chapter 33, verse 33. This verse speaks about Allah intending to remove all impurity from a specific group, the Ahlul Bayt, and purify them completely.
And what's the contextual issue there, according to this minority view?
Well, this verse appears within a larger passage that is primarily addressing the wives of the prophet. However, the grammar shifts noticeably in this specific verse. The pronouns change from feminine plural, referring to the wives in surrounding verses, to masculine plural, or mixed gender.
Ah, indicating it's addressing a different group than just the wives.
That's the standard interpretation, yes, identifying the Ahlul Bayt, Prophet Muhammad, Fatima, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, as the intended group. Now, the minority hypothesis here suggests that maybe this verse originally belonged elsewhere, perhaps in Surah Al-Insan, chapter 76, which describes the piety and sacrifices of a particular noble family.
Arguing it would fit more naturally there.
Right. And that it was moved into the passage about the wives, again, perhaps to create ambiguity or downplay its specific designation of the Ahlul Bayt.
But the source is clear. This idea of verses being moved is a minority position within Shia thought.
Extremely clear. It emphasizes this is not the mainstream Shia view at all. The vast majority of Shia scholars completely reject the notion that companions moved these verses.
So how does the mainstream Shia view explain these seemingly odd placements then? If they weren't moved, why are they where they are? Like the completion of religion verse among food laws.
The mainstream view holds that these placements weren't accidents or later alterations, but were entirely deliberate, part of Allah's divine wisdom and plan. They weren't moved. They were revealed to be placed exactly there for specific reasons.
Okay, what reasons?
Two main purposes are usually highlighted. The first is preservation. The idea is that placing verses with potentially contentious implications, like those seen as clearly establishing the status of the Ahlul Bayt, Ayah-e-Tathir, or marking the perfection of religion potentially linked to leadership, Al-Maida 5.3, within less obvious, seemingly unrelated contexts actually protected them.
How so?
It made them less likely to be targeted for omission or deliberate alteration by political factions later on who might have disagreed with their message. If they were grouped together in a blatantly obvious special status section, they might have been more vulnerable. Hiding them within other topics was a form of divine safeguarding.
So, paradoxically, the unusual placement made them safer.
That's the argument. The second purpose identified is that it serves as a test from Allah.
A test?
Yes. The idea that truth isn't always presented in the most straightforward, easy-to-digest manner. Placing key verses in contexts that require deeper reflection, study, and perhaps looking beyond the immediate surrounding sentences encourages believers to actively engage their intellect, to seek knowledge, to ponder, and not just passively receive.
Making you work for the understanding, essentially.
Exactly. It requires careful reading, cross-referencing, maybe consulting reliable interpretations. It forces you to think critically about why a verse might be placed where it is. The source notes that, yes, historically, this less obvious placement might lead some to misinterpret, like debating who Ayah-e-Tathir includes, but this challenge itself is seen as part of the divine test, pushing people towards deeper investigation.
So the mainstream view sees divine wisdom in the placement, not human interference.
Precisely. Preservation and testing understanding.
And the source wraps up with a quick point about the transmission of the Qur'an we read today.
Yeah, just a brief but interesting note. It mentions the specific qira, or method of recitation and transmission, that's most common globally today, the reading of Hafs as narrated from Asim al-Kufi.
The one most printed Qur'ans are based on.
Yes. And the source points out that the transmission chain for this specific dominant reading traces back through Asim al-Kufi to Abu Abdad al-Rahman al-Sulami, who was a known companion of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib.
So highlighting a connection between the standard, widely accepted text and a key figure in Shia Islam.
It's presented as a significant point regarding the continuity and transmission of the text accepted by the vast majority of Muslims.
Okay, so let's pull back a bit. We've journeyed through this source, looking at the big debate. Was the Quran sequence set by the Prophet under divine guidance or arranged later by companions?
We saw the arguments for the Prophet setting the sequence, the specific hadith evidence about verse placement, the lack of a clear human methodology in the final order, the logical argument about the Prophet's mission, and the historical silence on any major companion-led arrangement process.
And then we explore that fascinating side debate about specific verses. The minority Shia view hypothesizing political motives for moving certain verses,
Contrasted with the mainstream Shia view that sees those placements as divinely intended for preservation and as a test for believers, requiring deeper thought.
It really shows the depth of discussion, doesn't it? How scholars within the tradition have grappled with these questions about the text's very structure.
Absolutely. It's not just about the meaning of the words, but the history and integrity of the book itself.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, drawing from this deep dive. Consider that idea from the mainstream perspective, that the placement of some really key verses might have been deliberately less than obvious. If that's the case, designed perhaps to protect the text or to test our commitment to understanding, what does that suggest about how divine guidance works? And what does it imply about our own responsibility as readers and believers to actively seek out meaning and not just expect it to be handed to us? What stands out to you most from all this?